Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, January 30th, 2025, and our friend Richard Wolff and Michael Hudson are back with us. Welcome back.
Glad to be here.
Let's get started, Richard, with your article about the situation in the Middle East and the way that you're describing the Israel's dead end in that article. What is your understanding and what are you trying to say in that article?
Okay, yeah, the purpose of that article was to draw a connection that I think will help people understand the Israel Gaza horrors that we are living through. Um, and I don't just mean Gaza, the West Bank, the whole story there of that conflict. And what I link it to in this article is an experience of another settler colonialism, an attempt by a minority to take over a majority of people that are ethnically or religiously or otherwise distinct from them to and to see whether I can draw some lessons. And to do that, I made use of a book I published many years ago, which grew out of my doctoral dissertation, that had to do with the colonialism practiced in the East African country of Kenya by the British. My book covers the establishment of the British colony in that part of the world. Britain had several colonies in Africa, as I think most people know, and several in the eastern part of Africa, which is where Kenya is located. Long story short, what the British did there was to arrive and to make a determination all by themselves that they were going to establish a colony based on settling British citizens in the highlands in the middle, the geographic middle of Kenya. The highlands have a very fertile soil. They have a very good climate. It was a logical place for them to do this. And they made the effort to determine what would be good to grow there and to what would be good to produce. And again, long story short, they determined that would be coffee, which to this day is an important export of Kenya around the world. And they produce particularly Arabica coffee, which is the highest quality among coffees. And theirs is even better than most. In order to do this, they pushed away the Africans that had lived for centuries on this land. They forced them out. I mean, force, physical military force, and forced them into reservations, portions of land much inferior to the land they were forced out of. And very quickly, it was clear what the logic here was. The reserved areas, and the major group that suffered this was a tribal grouping, for those that might be interested, known as the Kikuyu tribe in that part of Africa. They could not survive on these reserved areas. There wasn't enough land. It wasn't a good enough quality. They weren't used to this kind of farming. This was an impossible way for them to survive. But of course, the British had the solution, which is, okay, you live on the reservation, and then every day you go to the coffee plantation and you work. And the coffee planters, the British settlers, paid your wages, which enabled you to get by. The government then came in, the British government, and taxed the wages. So it took back part of the money that the settlers pay. I mean, you have to laugh because the alternative would you'd have to cry, because what it meant was that these abused, expelled Africans had to work for next to nothing to grow the coffee, and then got taxed on their next to nothing so that the colonial government wouldn't have to tax the settlers, let alone the British people back home. So it was a desperate desire. By the way, all of this is explicit. I spent time in the British Colonial Office in London. I spent time in the British Museum in London, looking at all the records, and they all discussed it and they debated it. The British knew exactly what they were doing. Anyone who wants to excuse this nonsense by thinking that the British, and they love this phrase in England, muddled through, is nuts. They didn't muddle at all. They worked all this out. And that's why Kenya functioned as a commodity, as a colony. But eventually, and here's my point, this was an untenable arrangement because it was an immense exploitation of about 3 to 4 million Africans by a handful, a few thousand European settlers. And it produced tension and conflict and bitterness. The formal colony was established in 1895, and almost on schedule, 50 years later, around in the early 50s, it blew up. And suddenly the African population was no longer having individual efforts to change the situation or even small group efforts. It had a full-scale organized rebellion. And it was known as the Mau Mau Rebellion, was led by a very charismatic African leader named Jomo Kenyatta. And the British moved in to violently suppress the Mau Mau Rebellion. It was characterized in the most lurid terms you could imagine in the European press, which had it all set up as the rise of the savages who had to be put down by the benevolent British with their commitment to peace. So this war to make peace ended up with the victory of the British. They defeated the Mau Mau. They captured and imprisoned Jomo Kenyatta. It was one of those great ironies. It proved to the British that their situation was hopeless because whatever they did, what this Mau Mau rebellion had showed them was that the illusion that they could survive in a settler colonialism was an illusion, because in the Mau Mau put down, it's true, only 33 uh, settlers, I don't remember the exact number, a trivial number of settlers were killed, a very small number of European military were killed, and about 12 or 15,000 Africans were killed. So you have numbers that should remind you of Israel and the Palestinians. But the British had to face, they really had no choice, that what the Mau Mau had showed them is they would have to spend a fortune of money preparing for the next Mau Mau, which could happen at any time. The first Mau Mau they defeated, but they had learned how to fight. To repress the Mau Mau took the British 7 years, an enormous expenditure of money. And this was, remember, at a time when the rest of the British Empire, and particularly the center of it, namely India, had been lost to them. And they basically made the decision they can't do this anymore, because the prospect was for endless conflict, costing endless amounts of money, disrupting whatever that colony might hope to. It was a decision that you might say, let's cut our losses from what this is. And so even though they won the war, they ended up saying, okay, we're leaving. They released Mr. Kenyatta from jail, and he became the first president of an independent Kenya. And they've led their own life as a nation since that time to this moment that I'm speaking. And I hope I've given you a flavor. The transition to Israel should be fairly obvious, right? It's a settler colonialism. You plunk a group of mostly Europeans in the middle of a non-European community that's quite a bit larger. There's a bit of a difference that the Israeli percentage has grown and the Palestinian has shrunk, but it's still the case. The rest of it fits pretty well. And again, I would argue that what happened in October of 2023 was the rough equivalent of the Mau Mau uprising. You've now spent a fortune of money, dealt a blow to the Israeli economy from which it will take years to recover. Yes, you have the absurd imbalance between how many Israelis died and how many Palestinians died. But that is really like the African, and it doesn't change that what Israel is looking at now, having seen what Hamas could do, having now seen that Hamas could actually survive this onslaught that they unleashed on them, well, like the British, they are looking at an open-ended, when will this ever stop? And they have enough problems as a society. Adding this, and so I'm hoping that writing it up this way and drawing the parallels and making the equivalences might shed light on how to look at the Israeli phenomena and to see the dead end toward which it is moving and maybe come to some rational solution beforehand rather than, and this is directed as much at the Israelis in hopes they see it as it is to the Palestinians, because it does shore up the Palestinian notion that in the end they will win.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to add something?
Well, Richard has indeed written a wonderful article on the whole, certainly on British and European colonialism. France did exactly the same thing in Tunisia. His article's been widely reprinted. I read it on Naked Capitalism today, and there's been a long discussion about what makes Israel somewhat different from the Mau Mau in Kenya. And one of the differences is, of course, private sector Zionist financing. Richard makes the point that Britain decided that the cost of imposing the military empire on Kenya just wasn't worth the price. It was easier to give it its independence and then exploit it the old-fashioned way. Zionism is supported not only by the U.S. government, but by an enormous group of wealthy Zionist financiers of Israel. And one of the effects of this has been that Zionism has transformed American politics in a way that Kenya never transformed British politics. The Zionism through AIPAC was a major factor in leading the supporters of Citizens United to claim that it's okay to privatize American politics by letting private money be directly financing the campaigns of congressmen and senators. The Mau Mau had no fifth column in Britain to do this, not to mention the support from the Bible and the Christian fundamentalism. But there's also, I think, a different, something that goes beyond what the British did in Kenya. U.S. foreign policy wants to use settler colonialism for the broader purpose of controlling the Middle East oil and asserting political control over the Arab population. When Britain wanted to defeat the Mau Mau, it wanted to defeat it as a military force and a political force, but not to kill the native populations, because that would have deprived them of the workers that Britain wanted to work on the coffee plantations and other employments. But the U.S. doesn't have much use for the Arab population in the Near East. All it wants is the oil. And oil doesn't require as much labor as cultivating coffee plantations. I don't believe that there can be a two-state solution in Israel, as Alistair Crook and other people and I've discussed on this show. It looks like an either-or decision. One group or another has to win. And what makes this all the more urgent for Israel is that, as you pointed out at the beginning, there were many more natives in Kenya than there were British settlers. But in Israel, you have, even today, almost a 50-50 population split between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So the question is, what's going to happen? And what are we to make of, I think, over the last few days, President Trump has said he wants to withdraw all of the troops, American troops, from Syria. And it looks to me like he and the U.S. policy heads seem to have decided to let Jelani al-Sharia use ISIS to support control of the Arab states and their oil instead of relying on Israel to do this, because Israel just doesn't have the manpower that it's willing to sacrifice to fight other Arabs, whereas Jelani and the ISIS people are willing to die for their jihad against enemies that are not Wahhabi Sunni. That makes a big difference. That willingness to die, that terrorism of ISIS that America has funded and put in place is even much more brutal than the Israeli terrorism against the Arabs. So Israel lacks the resources and the troops to die to promote the U.S. Control of the oil, whereas the Sunni and Jelani are willing to do. So the other great question is whether that you leave sort of open at the end, how long Israel can actually survive as an economy. One of the results in the last year's fighting has been that a lot of leading Israeli industry has left the country, along with the skilled labor force that have left the country. A lot have gone to the United States or other places. The question is whether this trauma of the fight in Gaza is going to have a similar effect to the trauma of Kenyatta's fight against England. I guess we're going to see the result of that in the next year or two.
Could you spell out just a little bit more, Michael, how you see this possible withdrawal of American troops from what's left of Syria, how that is going to play out, and how Mr. Trump is going to work that out with Mr. Netanyahu, given that, if I understood you, he might be in the process of sacrificing Netanyahu to move American patronage over to the folks that have taken over in Syria.
Well, he's going to try to do it without sacrificing Netanyahu, but I think he's already stopped sending the bombs there. He's taken the Patriot missiles that were in Israel, and he's sent them all to Ukraine to try to use against Russia, apparently. What surprises me is that withdrawing from Syria means what were the U.S. troops doing there? They were stealing Syria's oil, mostly for Israel. Are Israeli troops going to come in and take control of the oil to send the oil to Israel? That hasn't been discussed, and I haven't even heard rumors about that. That's one of the open questions. Almost everything is an open question. I think you're right. Trump seems to be withdrawing from Israel as part of his withdrawing from the Near East and withdrawing from Ukraine and withdrawing from the whole NATO military neocon establishment. He's fired the neocons and has made no hostility of his opposition to the old neocons, even though he seems to be appointing new neocons there. I can't figure out what the game is. Certainly he's constrained, and ISIS and Jilani have been working so closely with Israel all along. Israel has basically been acting as the intermediary between the United States and ISIS and in Syria. So they certainly seem to have come to a modus vivendi there, but now you have Turkey playing a role as an intercession with Erdogan's hopes and fantasies about reestablishing the old Ottoman Empire. That's the wild card in all this. So you have the U.S. Attempt to control Near Eastern oil through the Arabs along with the Israelis. And then you have Turkey. Does it want the oil? What it's going to do? How long can this very delicate three-way triangulation occur? I don't think there's any way of foreseeing that right now. Everything is prone to surprises.
Well, I would add one again. That's helpful, but let me add another wrinkle, because the article did what I thought it could do. It, didn't cover everything. No article ever can. But there is this problem of the declining American empire. I'm beginning more and more to get the impression that historically, what Mr. Trump will be remembered for, or his regime, is simply having made the transition from a complete denial that the empire is in trouble, let alone declining, to an accommodation. It is declining, and we have to face it, and we have to withdraw because we can't afford it. It is like the British in a peculiar way, because it is costing the United States, the alliance with Israel, and being held by most of the world to be complicit in a genocide against Muslim people. This can't be a good projection of soft power. Whatever those words mean, this is the opposite of all of that. It is projecting, and the rest of the world sees it. I mean, everyone watches the growth of BRICS and the decline. The G7 was the alternative to BRICS, but the central player in the G7, the United States, is now busily threatening the economic survival of Canada and Mexico. Canada is part of the G7, and Mexico used to be an ally of the G7, basically. So everything's falling apart, and you have this sense Mr. Trump sees that in some way, or the people who fund him see it, and it's time for a recalibration. When Michael said before about my article that, the British withdrew from colonialism and then set about coming up with a different non-colonialist way of exploiting the Africans of Kenya, that's exactly right. And the United States is now trying to figure out how it can revive its global dominance, but without the kind of empire they presided over before, because they can't afford that anymore. They have to make and I can imagine someone in Erdogan's position noticing the emerging vacuum and wanting to be at least part of what fills it. The Europeans aren't going to fill it. They're on a death trip. So they're out of the story. They can't do hardly anything. This is a game in which the Chinese, in one way, and whatever the West can rescue, if it can, on the other side, and it's a reorganization of the world economy provoked by the inability of the United States to deal with all of the reaction against it that it has produced over the last 75 years. And that's very similar to the situation of what the British Empire provoked in the last 75 years, which is the first part of the first half or more of the 20th century. They destroyed themselves. They produced the Mahatma Gandhi and the end of their empire there, and the United States has produced it there. It's a little murky, and I think Michael agrees exactly how this is going to play out in terms of the U.S.-Israel connection. What happens to it? But it is now caught up in these larger forces. It is not going to shape what happens. It is going to have to suffer what happens.
Well, as you pointed out, at least Britain, France, and the United States had an alternative to outright military colonialism and occupation, and that's financial colonialism, economic colonialism. Trade colonialism is a means of control. But the United States has lost that, as we've been discussing on the last few shows with Nima. The United States doesn't have much to offer the rest of the world except relinquishing control of its oil, maybe agriculture. But the real one thing that the United States has to offer the rest of the world that other countries don't have, what makes the United States the exceptional country is it can offer not to bomb other countries. It can offer not to destroy their economy, to sanction them, and to militarily destroy them. All it can do is say, we won't hurt you and overthrow you with regime change if you do what we want. That's not a winning policy. That is the last straw, the last recourse of an empire that's falling. And I mean, to me, what you and I are watching here is the fight within the U.S. government right now. You've described what Trump's plan is, but you're seeing the fight yesterday, the day before. The front pages and long whole-page articles from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have been what to do to prevent Tulsi Gabbard from becoming Trump's national security advisor, and all sorts of personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, everything that the Democrats and the neocons can dig up against Tulsi Gabbard have been pushed before the public, and you can be sure that when the hearings on her begin in a day or two, for will she become the national security advisor, saying what the entire Congress, the entire CIA denies. She says that Russia is winning the war in Ukraine, and so she's accused of being a Russian puppet for saying that. She's accused of having actually gone to Russia and talked to Putin to see, if you're a national security advisor, you're supposed to know what the other parties think. She actually looks at what they thought. That is unpatriotic. If you talk to Putin, he is so hypnotically overpowering that you immediately become his puppet, they say. Not only that, she went to Syria and talked to Assad to try to, on a fact-finding mission, to see what's happening there. That makes her Assad's puppet. They act as if any acknowledgement that foreigners have an independent policy to react to American policy is unpatriotic, because the basic assumption underlying all American foreign policy models and planning is that foreign countries will have no response to any action that the United States does. They will simply be passive. There will be no blowback, no counter-reaction. That's why American military, economic, financial, and other policy has failed. It is a kind of hubris in believing that other countries have no alternative. And of course they do, but the fact that Tulsi Gabbard and other appointees that Trump wants to make are realistic is an attack on the unrealistic fantasies that have dominated the neocons in the United States, and which dominate the Senate that's still being bought out by neocon Israeli and other interests. So we're seeing the fight in the United States just as bitter as the international conflict between the United States and the BRICS and the rest of the world.
Yeah, let's remember that most of the rest of the world. Last week I read a reprint or a readout of a speech given by the intelligence chief inside Ukraine, which reached the conclusion that the Ukrainian army was 6 months away from a complete collapse. In other words, if the war continues for another 6 months, so we're talking this coming summer of the year 2025, then we won't be talking anymore about the war because it'll be over. The Russians will, I don't know how this works, and nobody does, but will be effectively the only military force unless all of NATO goes to war against Russia. Then it's open again, how that plays out. And if the head of the intelligence of your own country tells you it's over in 6 months, and what is every weapon, as far as I understand, every weapon that the West could have used in Ukraine, it has now used. It has given to Mr. Zelensky, and he has made use of it. And it's clearly not adequate to prevent the Russians from continuing the war, forcing the Ukrainian intelligence chief, if he isn't a complete fraud, to say, as the intelligence chief, let me tell you what an intelligent view looks at. The irony of this is that every major European government was effectively drawn in based on the history of NATO to endorse and support and pay money towards the American calculation that this was a great place to confront Russia. You could provoke Russia. Russia made the decision, put aside whether it was a right or wrong one, but they made the decision to invade Ukraine to stop a process which had already gotten quite far along, namely NATO moving east. And they calculated that this was a safe bet. This is now one of the greatest miscalculations ever. I mean, this is really, you blew it. You didn't understand the Russian military strength. You didn't understand the support the rest of the BRICS would give to Russia in order to strengthen it, to fight like this, blah, blah. And so all of them have to pursue this war. They have to have this crazed mentality that Michael just outlined. They can't see any of this because it would be to confront the ends of their career. They're going to go down with the defeat in Ukraine. That's their fear. That's why they make statements like, it's unthinkable that Russia would win. The whole world finds it perfectly straightforward to think that. They can't think that. They really are entered a war where they cannot think about losing it. That is a very dangerous way to make a war. Very, very dangerous. You are going to miss opportunities. You are going to pile mistakes on one another. You have to understand that you might lose and take the steps. Otherwise, that loss will be cataclysmic because you didn't calculate how to deal with when it goes badly. And you can see that. That's why they had to give them one weapon system that they had promised never to give them after another. They weren't in control anymore. They were desperate. They are desperate. And this Tulsi Gabbard, if she is the symbol of that desperation coming back to really haunt them, then let's be clear. This might be Trump. And even Mr. Trump may not see this yet. But if you can prevail and make it clear that the war in Ukraine was lost, you're giving Mr. Trump the opportunity to do to his political enemies what they had done to him. You demonize them. They are a disaster. When the communists in China won in 1949, it provoked here in the United States a horrible Red Scare, which was already underway anyway with McCarthy. But politician after politician, State Department official after state were hauled before committees in the full glare of politics. And the question asked was, you're responsible for our losing China. So once again, the other is rendered with no agency. So these bad people did that. Well, Mr. Trump is full of people who will remember and may discover that they have more to gain by demonizing anyone they can connect to the Ukraine war than any other way of defeating their political enemies. And we will then be, shown a government that will force us to be witnesses to an endless political drama of witch hunting the bad people who lost Ukraine.
Well, you made two important points. The first one, when you talk, who is the they in Europe who cannot conceive that somehow NATO might lose? The they are the politicians who look like they're being voted right out of power. In Germany, France, Italy, Slovakia, Hungary, and other places. So you're seeing a split that makes you wonder, how long can NATO survive, and ultimately, how long can the European Union survive as an arm of NATO? And your second point is sets the stage for the argument that we're going to be seeing for the next year or two. Who lost Russia? I think that Trump sees that this is going to be the great argument, and he doesn't want to be blamed for losing Russia. He wants to make it very clear that he came in as a peace candidate, not as a candidate who is still trying to live the Biden, neocon, Blinken, Zionist fantasy that somehow NATO could win and defeat Russia on its own borders. So I think he's already saying he wants peace because not only can't be win, but he's trying to reduce the American budget deficit so that his fantasy of balancing the budget, the neoliberal fantasy, can be met. So he's dissociated himself from the being blamed for the loss of NATO and trying to make it clear that the thought of backing Ukraine against Russia from the beginning was never really to win. It was simply to hope that Ukraine would drain Russian military, drain the Russian economy, leading to an economic collapse and regime change, which is, of course, fantasy. Well, you still had in the last few days, you had the crazy Estonian NATO EU lady saying that we've got to continue. The objective of NATO is to break Russia into a number of smaller countries. If NATO's to win, we cannot have strong countries. We have to break them up. This is the crazy fantasy that certainly the EU leadership and the current politicians in the EU leadership and the NATO leadership are in power. I think that Trump realizes that where this is leading is where you and I have forecast all along that NATO's pretty much over. And in fact, the U.S. reliance of Europe on Europe to act on its behalf with American support is over, and America has no intention at all of financing the NATO fantasy that somehow it can drain Russia. That's why Putin says, you Europeans have to raise your defense spending to 5% of GDP from your less than 2% of GDP that it is now. In other words, we're not going to pay anymore. We're not going to give our arms and money to Ukraine. You can do it if it's your fantasy, but this fantasy that the Biden administration and the neocons have promoted is your fantasy, not mine. And it's still the fantasy, of course, of the neocons, but this is, we're seeing a breakup of the narrative that has been behind this fantasy.
Yeah, and I wouldn't shortchange again the declining empire. The empire funded Europe in a fundamental way. We had military Keynesianism here. We had government spending crazily for a military that was crazy, right? Those statistics that we spend more on military than the next 9 countries in the world combined, even though most of those 9 are allies of the United States. We had this deal. We will provide the military umbrella. You don't have to in Europe do that. We will do it. Knowing, of course, that it's American money going into the American military industrial complex. That's most of what we're talking about. So it's a stimulant for American capitalism, gives it a floor below which it can't fall because of government spending, and it gives us reliable allies, a buffer against the Soviet Union all those years. But at this point, when we're running trillion-dollar deficits every year, it's becoming a problem. And you have to draw, you have to. You can hope that you can exploit in yet other ways, like the British did, but they knew they had to give up the control, and they had fought for that control all over the world. They had to give it up. And they could tell themselves there are other ways to exploit, and there were, and they did them. But I want to remind everyone also that the decline of Britain never stopped. It's weaker now than it has been in a century. The government of Mr. Starmer, doesn't know which way to turn. It's a horrible joke. The conservatives handed the Labour this government at a time when it's the worst possible time to be the government, because it looks so bad what it is you can't do. So I think that here in the United States, Michael is right, there's a terrible struggle going on, and it's not clear between Republicans and Democrats. I'm sure that struggle is going on inside both of those parties with their respective wings, because they've reached a point where the decline has to be faced. You can pretend it isn't there, but you have to face the practical consequences. What the Middle East looks like if the United States were to try to go in and replace the lost Syrian government in order to be, it would be in better control if all of Syria was an American base. Then you could have Syria and Israel, and they could together do. But those things are not available anymore. They can't do it. Or to say the same thing another way, without blowing the budget literally out, they can't do this thing, and so they are now forced. And Mr. Trump is doing a good job. He covers it all over as if it were making America great again, which it isn't. And if it's putting America first again, which it isn't. The people before him did that more than he's going to be able to do it, but he's bigger promoting it with advertising than they were. They didn't think they needed it. He grasps that they do.
Well, I think you're right. And if reality raises its ugly head in the way that you've described, then Trump's plan, and I think he'll be able to convince the Democrats to go along with it, is that NATO's Europe's problem. It's no longer America's problem. If NATO wants to fight Russia, let it. And of course, NATO doesn't have the ability to fight Russia because it costs too much. And if it cost America too much, imagine how much already it's cost Europe in the form of deindustrializing Germany's economy. All of Europe will have to impose austerity to fight a war that it can't possibly win. And it will also lose the Social Democrat Party, the Labor parties, all of the left-wing parties that are really the ultra-right-wing war parties that'll be overthrown by the nationalist parties, right-wing as they are. I think it's a tragedy that Europe doesn't have any real left-wing anti-war parties, except for Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany. But things do not look good for Europe in either way. If Europe can avoid the war in Ukraine and the military expense of taking over NATO from the United States, but it will be at the hands of right-wing anti-labor parties that are going to be pretty brutal and awful.
Yeah, and also, just to expand on one point, Europe, in many of its countries, provides a remarkably generous, at least by comparison to other countries, a social welfare system of free education and health care and all of the rest of it that we know quite well. And the only way to pursue this war would be either to run the risk of a crazed inflation, which they don't want to do, or the austerity, to take the money away from social welfare in order to fight a war they have now for 3 years lost. This is a recipe, as Michael correctly says, for being politically destroyed. Your working class will go over to the right wing if the right wing says we won't do this. And the right wing is able to do that now, partly because it doesn't have a serious left threat. That could emerge, but they don't have it now. Otherwise, you continue to have what you have now, which is a kind of mixture between a right wing, which says no more of this war, and the left wing, which says no more of this war. That's it. That's the overwhelming majority of the mass. And how long these people can keep up a costly war when the left wing and the right wing have deserted them, I mean, I wouldn't bet on them. They wouldn't bet on themselves under those circumstances.
So it looks like the class war is back in business.
Yes, yes. It always was. It just was covered over by advertisers telling you that it wasn't, and it wasn't there, and all the rest of it. I was struck the other day when a Western commentator wrote, or he spoke, and he had this wonderful idea based on a question posed by an interlocutor. He said, your question is really interesting, but the only way I know how to answer it is to say, there is this thing, which we don't talk about much, he said. It's called the surplus. And you can think about the economy as though some people produce a surplus that flows to other people. And if you think like that, here's some interesting, he was teaching, and by the way, this is no leftist, no Marxist, no nothing. He was teaching the journalist that there was this other thing that it might be worth thinking about. It was a charming moment. It was a charming moment.
What it's all about.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, just before wrapping up this session, here is what Donald Trump said about his policy toward Taiwan.
Future, we're going to be placing tariffs on foreign production of computer chips, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals to return production of these essential goods to the United States of America. They left us and they went to Taiwan, which is about 98% of the chip business, by the way. And we want them to come back, and we don't want to give them billions of dollars like this ridiculous program that Biden has. Give everybody billions of dollars. They already have billions of dollars. They've got nothing but money, Joe. They didn't need money. They needed an incentive, and the incentive is going to be they're not going to want to pay a 25, 50, or even 100% tax. They're going to build their factory with their own money. We don't have to give them money. They're going to come in because it's good for them to come in. They're giving them money. They don't even know what they're going to do with it. I had people tell me, we have no idea. We didn't need money. They don't know if they're probably going to use the money to build in other places, other countries. It's a ridiculous plan, very expensive and ridiculous. The only way you'll get out of this is to build your plant. If you want to stop paying the taxes or the tariffs, you have to build your plant right here in America. That's what's going to happen at record levels. We're going to have more plants built in the next short period of time than anybody ever envisioned before, because the incentive is going to be there because they have no tariff whatsoever. In fact, they have help from us if they build their plant in America.
Chinese government pays a tariff.
No, they don't.
Yes, they do.
I want to say, I'm an importer and exporter for 20 years.
Okay.
When a product comes into the US, there's something called a tariff sheet.
Okay.
I, as the buyer of that product, follow US law and pay the tariff. I'm an American citizen, an American taxpayer. I pay that tariff to the US government, and that increase in the cost I then sell to you for a higher price because I've got to cover that tariff.
Then what about,
there is
then
no,
what do you say our tariffs are higher when they go overseas as opposed to theirs coming here?
Tariffs are never a zero-sum game. Tariffs are a tool. For example, you might say, you want to sell us your beans.
Yeah.
We are going to give you a low tariff if you buy our corn. But the cost of the tariff is ultimately always borne by the consumer.
Don't you think at the end of the day there may be more competition within the market of the U.S. government?
You're confusing the question. This is not a question of competition. The point we're discussing is who bears the cost of the tariff.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you if it's good policy for the U.S. government to tax beans and for the Chinese government to tariff corn. But what I can absolutely assure you is that a product that comes into the U.S. is paid for by a U.S. company, and the increased cost of that is borne by all of us. I am an importer and exporter. I do it for a living.
Okay. Then what's the alternative if at one point in our country's history was tariffs that paid for our economy?
Tariffs don't pay for your economy.
But they did. We didn't have income tax.
That was before we had municipal infrastructure.
Correct.
Yeah. Here is the. Let me
be naive enough to let its computer chip industry be hostages in the sense that China's TikTok has been a hostage. If Taiwan says, all right, we're not going to employ Taiwanese and make money here, we're going to build it in America to employ Americans instead of Taiwanese, that Taiwan already has said that the Americans are not willing to work as hard as the Taiwanese and don't have the training. But just imagine that if at some point Taiwan should say, well, we've decided not to fight China. We've decided that our future lies to reintegration with China in a Hong Kong-like relationship. We want to invest in China, not the United States. The United States will then confiscate the computer chip factories that Taiwan have made here, or it will say, just like we made China sell TikTok for pennies on the dollar, or we'll close you down. You can sell your billions of dollars of investment here for pennies on the dollar to the United States because you're not our friend anymore because you're friendly with China. And it's you're with us or you're against us. Is Taiwan going to be so silly as to go along with Trump's threats?
Yeah, I'm always amazed at this ability not to understand what the options are. If Taiwan comes here and does what Mr. Trump wants it to do, it is going, forget what the Taiwanese company, or for that matter, the Taiwanese government, the whole rest of the world will look upon this enterprise in a completely different way. First of all, if the government can control the Taiwanese company that way, they know that dealing with the Taiwanese government always puts you in a dependent relationship to the United States government, which has shown you what it is prepared to do. So the only safe thing to do is to minimize your relationship with the Taiwanese chip producer. Produce one yourself. Get the Chinese, who are showing us that they can do almost all of this stuff as well or better than the West anyway. So you will diversify 50 times faster. Mr. Trump seems to think he can do these things, and there's no fallout. There's no consequence. There's nothing that could happen to undo the objective that drove this bill. This is a very bizarre way of thinking. It didn't even apply in the heyday of the American empire. You couldn't think this way in the 1970s and 80s without making terrible mistake. But to do it now? Are you crazy? Especially if the Taiwanese company has to come here and pay American salaries and what? those chips will not be able to be carried by a truck, the inputs, nor carried out of the factories with trucks, the output, because the Americans can't buy Chinese electric trucks. We have 100% tariff on them, which means the costs of the trucks that are going into it will be radically different here with 100% tariff than they would be over everything changes. For me, it just in terms of how you think about things, you want to shake Mr. Trump and the people around him, metaphorically, obviously. You want to shake them. How do you reason like that? We're gonna this and then they're gonna do that. Really? You think the world works? You decide to do something, and you can tell me clearly and 100% what the outcome is. Has he never understood the concept of unintended circumstances? Has he never understood that when you capture a model, a notion of A causes B, that's never the truth? Because there's always loads of other things going on that impact your B, and it's not reducible to an effect of A. I mean, you're supposed to learn this in the third grade, basically. And we're seeing people in very high office unable to think it through. Every president of the last dozen has made the statement, I am going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. 12 presidents out of 12. None of them ever succeeded. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats. Are it because these people are all stupid? Hardly. A, they're not stupid, and B, they were articulating a goal they need to articulate. They lack the means to achieve it. And Mr. Trump lacks them also because they're not all in his control. This is crazy. He misunderstands blaming your political opponent, which is a game they all play. Now he has to discover that the reason his predecessor couldn't do these things is often because they weren't achievable. He didn't have the means. Not that he's a stupid person or inadequately patriotic. Come on. This is sort of silly, but it passes now for great wisdom.
Well, what the American narrative lacks is exactly what you've been saying. They lack the acknowledgement that it is a fantasy to restore American industry without transforming American society. Because to transform it, you would have to do things like begin to have the government provide basic services like medical care and education in the same way that social democracies do. That if you privatize medical care, 18% of US GDP. If you privatize education, 50,000 a year in student debt, then you're not going to have an internal market that is necessary for industrialization, and you're not going to be able to have an export market because of the high cost of paying American labor that has to pay for its own health care and education. We've been discussing this for the last year on NEMA, and the narrative is unrealistic to the core. And if you try to interject realism into the narrative and say, here's what's really needed in order to industrialize, you're going to have to be more socialist. And the refusal of America to be socialist puts us right back in the class war here is as much in business as it's going to be in Europe under the right wing. And the class war is not a way to industrialize because in fighting labor, it fights the necessity and the precondition for industrialization to occur on an international scale from the United States.
That's right. They can't face it. And they can't face that over the last 40 years, a society quite different from this one, namely the Chinese, have been able to achieve economic growth no one predicted, no one foresaw, Not even over there in China did they understand what they were able to do. And, just last week we saw, another example of high tech as they produced a better AI operation than anybody had done for a tiny fraction of the cost. I mean, how many whether it's solar panels or electric vehicles. Yeah, I mean, and they're opening a new university every month, and we're closing them down every month. And what do you think that means? It's Michael's point. It's the private funding of education is drying it up. Making students have these absurd debts means they're not going to go to the universities anymore. So we're reducing our pool of educated people when they're expanding theirs, and they have a much bigger population. I mean, it's everywhere screaming at you, but they think that Mr. Trump wielding tariffs. I kid you not. This is the craziest thing. Think about it. Tariffs are one tool that governments have. That's no question. It's been that way for a long time. There's an enormous literature, which if you study international trade, you study tariffs, what they do, what they don't do, what their secondary and tertiary effects are, have been in this. The notion that Mr. Trump discovered in his first presidency, that where other things were difficult for him to maneuver, he had gotten the power to impose a tariff because an earlier Congress had given the president a kind of unusual freedom to wield the tariff. By the way, done during a time when tariffs were not an important tool of the government. Now they're sorry, and he discovered, here's how I can do my theater of being the powerful one who comes in and gets things done. I have a tariff. It's like the old joke. If you're a carpenter, everything looks like a nail, right? If you're a tariff wielder, every problem is soluble by the appropriate administration of a tariff. And he's going to announce it, and he can slap him. Notice the mistake he has always made. He keeps saying, and your clip addresses that the tariff that he imposes on Chinese goods is paid for by the Chinese. And so every teacher of economics from the earliest level has to explain to his or her students, no, the tariff is paid by the United States to its own government. It's not about China. China has 500 ways to get around the tariff, which you would know if you read the literature of international trade, which goes through all of that. He's not wielding it because it's the right tool, the best tool. He's wielding it because he can, because it's something he can do to fulfill the theater of the strong leader, reversing the mistakes of the past. So he's all day about that. It's like deporting people. Something else he can do. Very dramatic. A tariff and a deportation order. How exciting. The last week he's issued, 50 executive orders, and 49 of them are being contested in the courts. That's his problem. They can't contest his tariff. They gave him the power to go ahead and do that. And that's what we're watching. With the hype to which the mainstream media fall prey, with the hype that this is the appropriate tool rather than one of the few he has to perform the political theater that got him elected.
Well, Richard, the irony of all this is that for the last few years, you and I have tried to explain how the rest of the world can free itself from neoliberalism and from the American empire. And it turns out that the person who's much more successful than either of us is Donald Trump and his gang from isolating the American empire itself from the rest of the world. Who would have thunk?
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further as a closer. He may end up being the best recruiter and mobilizer of an internal left in the United States far better than the efforts of you, me, and many other people have proven to be.
All
He
we can do
made
is spell out what he's doing. Yep.
the spectacle of parents and children being shackled in an airplane and dumped on a runway in Colombia because that government is afraid not to do it. That's not an image that's going to build for him. That's an image that's going to build for us. And the endless experience of one police department after another watching people yanked off the street. And already they've made mistakes. They've yanked Native Americans. You know, the irony, you're deporting the people who were here before we, the deporters, ever got here. You know, they don't know who they're getting. They don't know. They've not gone through any procedure. All of that will eventually go back to court. What a mess this man is creating. And there are going to be a lot of people who reevaluate what's going on. So, yeah, we may owe Mr. Trump way more than we thought we might when he emerged.
Well, to do that, we need a new political party as an alternative to the Democrats. That's the real challenge for the left. Can there be another political party?
Yeah. Actually, Jill Stein was talking about it recently. I don't know.
Well, you know, we should take a clue. The number one party in the French Parliament is a party that was formed two years ago. It's a unification of older parties, yes, but it's a new party that has to do a lot of the things a new party has to work out. And the Aufstand, if that's the right word, Aufstand für Deutschland in Germany, also a relatively new party. You know, and so new political formations are happening all over the place, and it may, in fact, come over here and stimulate and inspire and support comparable efforts here. Wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard and Michael, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.